Welcome to Washington in Focus Daily. It is Thursday, July 23rd, 2026, and I'm Carleen Johnson, the Center Square, Washington's state government reporter. And in today's episode, a conversation with Idaho Governor Brad Little's budget director for a comparison, if you will, between Idaho's budgeting process and Washington's fiscal restraint or lack thereof when it comes to budget priorities. They've got healthy reserves in Idaho, just rolled $250 million into 2027's budget picture, and all the residents got a nice little tax refund, the largest ever this year. So they have an income tax in Idaho. So it's an important sort of comparison, contrast budget picture. And I think you'll find the conversation with the governor's budget director pretty interesting. An update then from Save Family Farming in a complaint against an activist group in Yakima, a group that got $500,000 of Climate Commitment Act money in a grant. And they used some of that funding to produce an anti-farming or a series of anti-farming social media clips, videos, and other materials. And then they put the Department of Health logo on there because the Department of Health is responsible for doling out some of this CCA grant funding. Problem is you can't do that. But those logos, those DOH sort of stamp of approval on the videos and other materials remains there, at least as of this time yesterday. I didn't check today, but it's still there, even though DOH assured Save Family Farming it was down. And then lastly, if you're on social media anywhere, you've probably started to see the groups that are coming out against the newly qualified income tax repeal initiative, I-645, which will be on your November ballot. Then voters can decide if they want the income tax or they don't want the income tax. But these groups are going to spend a whole lot of money, and you'll start to see, and you'll hear radio ads, you'll see TV ads. So who's funding all of this? Well, it turns out it's pretty much all unions, the very unions that stand to benefit from the income tax and lobbied for it in Olympia this session. So Brian Haywood of Let's Go Washington, the group behind the income tax repeal initiative, has some words to share with us about that. All right, let's dive in. The state of Idaho closed the books on fiscal year 2026 recently. How that fiscal year works, it's like in summer, they finally end, from 2025 to 2026, that fiscal year is how that operates. And they ended up in the black, in fact, rolled $250 million in cash balances to the general fund for next year. The Idaho State Tax Commission also issued more than $910 million in individual income tax refunds during the fiscal year, the largest amount ever returned. And then there's Washington, where yet another budget gap is looming for 2027. I've seen various figures, but about $4 billion apparently in deficit is how we're going to start the legislative session for 2027. That will be fun, won't it? Credit rating agencies have started to say, hey, you're on notice. We may downgrade your credit rating, which then, of course, reduces our ability to borrow at a decent interest rate for important issues, for bonds and other, large dollar, investments that are already promised to be made in the state. So I reached out to the office of Idaho Governor Brad Little this week, and his budget director responded and granted me a pretty fascinating interview. So her name is Lori Wolff, and she told me that Idaho residents, as I mentioned, received the largest tax refund in their state history, and they still have that $250 million rollover into next year. And that's due to some fiscal restraint, she says, even in good times when the cash is rolling in.
When all that federal money came in a couple of years ago, you saw states investing that in ongoing programs versus one-time needs or one-time investments. And Idaho did not do that. We did invest in one-time projects, one-time needs. And we do that consistently. We make sure that we have a structurally balanced budget and that the ongoing revenue we have coming in fits our ongoing needs. I think sometimes, when people look at one of the hard things in government budgeting is revenues ebb and flow, right? And you're constantly looking at, I think, what priorities you have. So it's a balance sheet, but it's also a reflection of your values and priorities. And, we've been able, our revenue here in Idaho did, it slowed a little. We were not in recessionary times, but we saw that slow a little bit, just like we've seen that across the nation. And our governor and what we've done in the budget office is, we look at that and we reprioritize. So it did not mean we had to make broad cuts around across all state government. In fact, the governor protected his highest priorities, which was public education, transportation, water infrastructure, economic development, workforce. And we made sure that we were able to invest in that while finding efficiencies in places that we could restrain some of our spending in other areas. We've also been able to do back-to-back tax cuts over the past several years, and we balance the tax cuts with that spending. Making sure that we're just not taking all of the money from Idaho taxpayers and finding new things to spend it on, but we're very disciplined in the areas that we feel government should be involved in spending money, and we make those decisions in the governor's budget recommendations.
Now, as we've shared in recent months since our new income tax law was signed by Governor Bob Ferguson, there are a lot of businesses, there are a lot of wealthy individuals um, heading for the exits or talking about doing so. Many citing that millionaires tax as the final straw. Again, it is, you probably know if you're watching this podcast, it's 9.9% of a tax on income above $1 million or combined household income in excess of $1 million, taxed at that 9.9% rate. But many of those businesses say it's going to hit them as pass through entities and how they report income, business profits, if you will, on their individual personal income taxes. And so they're going to get dinged. And so they're not going to stick around to see if this thing expands, although many believe it will eventually be a tax on all income levels. But Wolf told me, yes, Idaho has an income tax, but being a flat rate and a predictable rate, she says, is not keeping people out. In fact, quite the opposite.
And we do have an income tax, and individual income tax is one of the major sources of funding to our general fund. But we've done a lot to simplify our tax policy. We have a flat tax in Idaho. So, right now, both corporations and individuals pay 5.3%, which is a lot lower than even a federal rate, but it's predictable and it has simplified our tax code. Um, Also, this year, actually, we just closed out our fiscal year, and Idaho delivered the highest rate of individual refunds ever in state's history, almost $1 billion in tax refunds out to Idaho families. And our budget is still fine, and our economy is going strong. So, when you ask families what matters to them, rarely do we have Idahoans ask us to get rid of the income tax because it's not that burdensome. And we at the state level try to find ways to invest even in our local economies and our local infrastructure needs to try to reduce the pressure on property tax as well. So, it takes kind of that combined effort between the state and locals, because at the end of the day, we want more money in their pockets. And you get rid of income tax, you're going to have to tax them somewhere else, because if you continue to spend, you're going to have to figure out that revenue source. So just getting rid of one tax base doesn't necessarily solve your problem. It's simplifying it, it's making it fair and predictable. And, that's really what good tax policy looks like.
Now, voters will get to decide in November if they want to keep the income tax or want to repeal it. Of course, we also have a legal challenge, a group that's challenged the constitutionality of the law that is also pending. And also, this week, a group of lawmakers, budget officials, some folks from Governor Ferguson's office, some business and labor groups had their first meeting on what's apparently going to be a 2-year long endeavor to figure out how to budget better. in Washington. They're going to look at revenue forecasts. They're going to look at spending decisions and how all of that contributes to some of these structural imbalances that we seem to have every single year, and some of the volatility. It's a bipartisan group, and there are 8 lawmakers on that panel, two from each of the 4 legislative caucuses, and then, as I mentioned, some members from Governor Bob Ferguson's office and some business associations, labor organizations. I wanted to tease that I'm going to be talking to one of the lawmakers who's on that committee, Representative Travis Couture of Allen. He's a Republican, and he is the chief Republican on the House Appropriations Committee. So he is on that committee, and we'll find out. I'm curious to find out, is he optimistic going into this endeavor that really we can get spending under control? Because as we've heard many say, including some former Democratic governors recently say, they don't believe we've got a revenue problem in the state of Washington. We've got a spending problem. So I'll be anxious to share that with you in tomorrow's episode of Washington in Focus Daily. All right, now to an update on a Yakima based anti farm activist group called We Are Aya. It's spelled Ella, ELLA, but pronounced We Are Aya. Now, according to the Washington Department of Health, the group lied to their agency after getting $500,000, a grant from Climate Commitment Act money. They got about $500,000. And DOH says the group then lied to them about using their Department of Health logo to fabricate the appearance of that agency's endorsement in the materials they were producing. And they made some videos that came out with some accusations against Lower Yakima Valley farms. And it was Save Family Farming, the group that originally complained after seeing the DOH endorsement on some of the materials that were being produced. They went to DOH and said, "Do you realize they're using your logo?" It took many, many months to get any response from the Department of Health. But then DOH eventually said, after a whole lot of pressure from Safe Family Farming and some lawmakers that got involved and started asking questions, they said, "Oh, we've got confirmation now that We Are Aya is no longer using our Department of Health logo, and that any of the materials that they produced, social media posts, those have all been removed." And that's what they told Save Family Farming. That was not the case at all. So this is Save Family Farming's executive director, Ben Tyndall, who told me in an interview yesterday that the DOH logo is still very much on some of those videos online. And DOH is now admitting, yeah, well, we never actually checked ourselves. We just kind of trusted when We Are Aya said, yeah, we're going to take that stuff down.
I in my head, I have I guess critics or pushback. You're making a mountain out of a molehill. These are a couple social media videos. These are small things. And my response is, you're right. This is a very small thing that, should have taken a handful of minutes to correct, to adjust, but it's kind of the tip of the iceberg that it looks small compared to what is laying underneath this lack of accountability, this lack of accountability the state has to the grantees who are receiving hundreds of thousands of yours and my dollars that we are putting in whenever we go to, fuel our cars up or a variety of reasons. And as well as you're taking the grantee's word for it. And this just shows this particular organization, We Are Aya, not only do they put out false anti-farming propaganda that is not scientifically backed, it is very manipulated, it is very much twisted, and their messaging is incorrect and presenting a very false image of farming in our state, as well as they're not only willing to manipulate and deceive the public like you and I, they're also going to directly lie to a state agency. That the Department of Health in writing says we were basing the fact that this has been corrected because we heard either verbally or by email the grantee confirmed not that they were going to deal with this, but that it had been corrected. That they were told, the Department of Health was told, yes, this has been corrected, which was patently false.
Now, Save Family Farming informed the Department of Health on July 16th, so just last week, that they had filed a complaint with the Washington State Auditor's Office and then got some state lawmakers involved. And then DOH did finally respond and admitted basically, yeah, so here's what happened. We didn't actually check for ourselves. We just took their word that the materials were down. Um, didn't explain why they didn't check for themselves. But remember, this is a $500,000 in CCA money. So your tax dollars, when you go to fill up at the gas pump and you've got other places that you get hit by the CCA Climate Commitment Act taxes. So taxpayer dollars provided to an activist organization that then used some of that to produce anti-farming materials that Say Family Farming says were outright lies in many cases. Um, and then they put the Department of Health endorsement logo across those materials, which certainly made it look like what they were producing was endorsed by the Department of Health, the Washington State Department of Health. And that was not the case. And then, of course, the state agency responsible who gave them that money, your tax dollars, um, then, was not able to follow through and ensure that their logo was off the materials, even though it was brought to their attention. And Say Family Farming kept saying over and over again, you got to do something about this.
We are seeing record numbers of CCA funding that is going to the state for various, levels of climate or social justice type of actions. Um, who's holding them accountable? Who is holding and kind of keeping that money accountable? And we're seeing that that is really a there's a lot of behind the scenes work going on. There's a lot of things that really aren't being very transparent. And so we're using this as a tool to show we need to see accountability. We need to see accountability with these nonprofit organizations that are benefiting. We're also needing to desperately see accountability with these agencies that are supposed to be, funding and kind of facilitating the logistics of these. And so we're working with legislators. We're letting certain legislators know. Like I said, we're sharing this information with the various legislative caucuses in the state, trying to generate some interest to see, something needs to be done. Who is the legislative champion that's willing to step up and say, okay, enough's enough. We've got to start reining this in. We've got to hold some things accountable. We've got to see transparency in ways that we haven't seen yet. Because this is just the tip of the iceberg. This is one example that we're using to really showcase and highlight what we think is more of kind of an epidemic problem with the state right now.
I did reach out to the Department of Health and several of their media contacts and told them that I was producing the article today and that I had interviewed Save Family Farming and I wanted to get the Department of Health's response. No one responded, but I have seen the confirmation from the Department of Health sent to Save Family Farming that basically said, "Yeah, we just took their word for it, and but we're sure that stuff's down now." Well, as of yesterday, as I mentioned, it still wasn't down. The materials that have the DOH logo are still very much in circulation. So that is, that's something that the Department of Health is going to have to answer to. And I am putting up an article on the Center Square Washington's page today. So I encourage you to check that out with a lot more of a deeper dive on this whole controversy. All right, now public sector unions, which will directly benefit from the millionaire's tax, make up virtually all of the contributions so far to the campaign against the initiative that could repeal Washington's newly enacted income tax. This is according to publicly available records on the Public Disclosure Commission site. And my colleague TJ Martinell has an article up today on the Center Square Washington page. But I want you to see a video clip here from Brian Haywood of Let's Go Washington, the group that put up Initiative 645 to potentially repeal or let voters decide if they want to repeal the new income tax. Um, and the unions here are specifically the Washington Federation of State Employees, $1 million already for donations. The SEIU 775 ballot fund, as the purple shirts in Olympia that are always there, and SEIU Initiative Fund donated each a $500,000. So that's where the money to convince you not to support Initiative 645 to repeal the income tax. That's where that money is coming from. So here's Brian Haywood.
They're spending big money to protect an income tax. Why is that? Is it because they love the children and small puppies and seals? No, it's because they got their hand in the trough. And I think there's one more that's not on there yet, which is the WEA, because I'm getting people. I've had teachers say, "Hey, look, I'm getting a ton of text messages from the WEA telling me to vote no on the 645," which says that the WEA is spending money. So I don't know where that's going to get reported and needs to be looked at. But whoopsie. SEIU and the WEA, the three public unions, um, they collectively take in about $150 million every single year. That's tax free. It's tax exempt. They don't pay any taxes on their money they take in, and they can just use that on political expenditures like getting an income tax imposed and then defeating the attempt to repeal it. And it absolutely exposes what everyone talks. Anyone that goes down to Olympia will always tell you, yeah, the SEIU, WA, they're running all the legislation coming out of Olympia. And so I think the PDC gives us an insight into who are these guys. I went up and looked at it myself on the after I got a notification from me. I looked at who are the other people that have donated, and there's no other single individual that's even big enough. It's like $110, like it's these big ones. It's $1 million from WFC, then two SEIUs at a $500,000 each, and then it's like 110,000, 110 not thousand, $110 by a bunch of small donors. So union employees putting money so they can look like they have people. I don't know.
Yeah.
There's nobody else, right?
And again, there's an article up at the Center Square Washington's page today, written by my colleague TJ Martinell, with a lot more on this and some of the concerns being raised about the unions that are dumping money into these are taxpayer employees that are dumping money into the campaign to convince you to vote against the initiative that could repeal the income tax. So check it out. And thanks for watching today's episode of Washington in Focus Daily for this Thursday, July the 23rd. Join us again tomorrow. It'll be Friday. I hope you'll watch.